live on Twitter. So we should be live on Twitter on Tuesdays now. With all those tech issues, we have some sort of a storm down here too because the towers went out, but they got it working. Hey, better late than never. Thank you guys for being here. We will be having Dr. Tartaglia come on to debate all of this great existentialism versus analyticalism that we've been discussing with Kierkegaard and Edwards' response to that. But we're going to be able to move on from that. We only have 3 more essays to do. When we get the tech issues working with Dr. Tartaglia, we will definitely revisit that discussion before we're finished with this section. But for right now, let's get into On the Eclipse of God by Fackenheim. In one of the writings, Martin Heidegger quotes with approval, as applying it to the present, these words of the early 19th century German poet: "Alas, our generation walks in night, dwells as in Hades without the divine." When the poet wrote these words, there cannot have been many people who agreed with him, for it was an age which thought of itself as about to reach the very summit of religious enlightenment. In our own age, by contrast, an age which is acquainted with catastrophe and stands in fear of even greater catastrophes to come, hardly anyone can think of himself as walking in anything but night. And while it is not immediately clear whether this means that we must dwell, quote, without the divine, unquote, indeed, that is the question to which these reflections are addressed. It is at any rate perfectly clear that we are undergoing an unprecedented crisis of religious faith. All right, so his first section is the indestructibility of biblical faith. According to a widespread view, it is the very catastrophes of the 20th century which have brought the crisis about. The ancient belief, of course, that's backwards, right? The ancient belief that the divine is with us, that God lives and cares, cannot, it is said, be sustained in the face of these catastrophes. For to sustain it requires smugness and blindness to tragedy. Yet the fact is that this view reflects a complete lack of understanding of the nature of religious faith in general and biblical faith in particular. Biblical faith, I mean both Jewish and Christian, is never destroyed by tragedy, but only tested by it. And in the test, it both clarifies its own meaning and conquers tragedy. Here precisely lies the secret of its strength. Consider a few examples. The prophet Jeremiah lives to see the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, of the whole national existence of Judah. He does not deny the tragedy or seek to explain it away, but neither does it occur to him that God's existence has now been refuted, or that he can no longer be conceived as just or as loving his people Israel. To Jeremiah, the destruction of the temple is a manifestation of divine justice, and it does not mark the end of divine love. There is hope for the future. Okay, before we go on, Savad came up with a very clever plan, and we are probably going to be starting that on Saturday soon, where we will be playing and commenting on and having a study group around Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures. A couple of comments on the way he's thinking right now, but I'm reminded of that. I just finished the Exodus panel discussions, which I believe are a prelude to Jordan Peterson's Exodus lectures that he's going to give on his own, if I've heard correctly. In any case, there was an interesting story that Dennis Prager, who was a part of the panel, said that in during the Holocaust there was um, a group of Jewish scholars, I believe. Maybe they were in the concentration camp at the time. I don't remember, but he said they put God on trial, and essentially they tried God for having broken the covenant with Israel. So it's about this issue of the 20th century tragedies, right? So they said, okay, has enough bad happened that God has abandoned his people and broken his covenant with us? And they had, like a God's lawyer and their lawyer, and they had the whole thing out. And then what he said happened was that they came to the conclusion that God had broken his covenant with the people of Israel. And then when they came to that conclusion, they then said, okay, now it's time for evening prayers, sort of like a recommitment that they were going to keep their side of the covenant, despite the fact that they thought God was being faithless. Um, well, this is what he's talking about. He's trying to say that the tragedies of the 20th century have made people think that perhaps God doesn't exist. Of course, Nietzsche, we just finished with Kierkegaard and the existentialists. he actually predicted the tragedies, and he had it the other way around. He's like, no, God, our highest values have died for us. They're not something we can believe in anymore. And as a result, you will see tragedies like you've never seen before. But clearly, this gentleman is coming from the perspective of, okay, even if that were the case, it's a wake up call to those who thought that we could go around and keep believing in God or something like that. That there's a crisis for a lot of people based on the tragedies that have happened in the 20th century. And now he's trying to argue that actually it's in tragedy that the clarification of the religious belief is made and its triumph over that tragedy. So he gives the example of Jeremiah. Now he says in the case of Job, it's still more extreme because Job is struck by tragedies which are explicitly said to be beyond the bounds of any conceivable divine justice. Yet Job never denies the existence of God, nor does he follow his wife's suggestion that he curse God and die. His faith is reduced to utter unintelligibility, yet he persists in it. Let me give a final example, which, at least in what I really feel like the Book of Job is it's a heck of a thing to have in the canon of Christian um, scripture, because with Jeremiah, with the different prophets, with Genesis, you've got all sorts of different aspects of the struggle of being highlighted, right? You've got like social injustice, and you've got betraying the highest virtues, and you've got repentance, you've got the spirit of Cain, you've got ways of wrestling with God, you've got all of this. But Job, if the book of Job wasn't included in the Bible, then you might read it and say, "Oh, there's a right way, and I'll find the formula, and I'll live according to that, and then everything will go well." And if you have that idea, Job will take that away from you. Um, in any case, so let's see here. Let me give a final example, which, at least in one respect, is still more extreme. The example of the psalmist. Even in the midst of unintelligible tragedy, Job never wholly loses his sense of the presence of God. The psalmist in extremis, however, does. When he complains that God has, quote, hidden his face, God is not, at least not now, present. Unlike Job, the psalmist does not ask that God's ways be made intelligible to him. He does not ask that the valley of the shadows or the netherworld be made to vanish. He asks only that God be present while he walks through them, as God was present to him before. Yet, even in the most extreme of all crisis situations, God having hidden his face, the psalmist never loses his faith. He never says that God does not after all exist, nor that, though existing, he has finally ceased to care. In practice, the two assertions would amount to the same thing. What he does say is that unaccountably God has hidden his face, that he has hidden it for only a while, and that he will turn his face back to man again. That's a pretty good point. Put radically, I mean, it's a good point that that dark night of the soul struggle. Uh, Maybe undercuts my point that Job is the book that makes the scriptures fully adult. In any case, put radically, this means that there is no experience, whether without or within, that can possibly destroy religious faith. Good fortune without reveals the hand of God. Bad fortune, if it is not a matter of just punishment, teaches that God's ways are unintelligible. Not that there are no ways of God. A full heart within indicates the divine presence. An empty heart bespeaks not of the non existence or unconcern of God, but merely his temporary absence. Religious faith can be and is empirically verifiable, but nothing empirical can possibly refute it. Okay, two things. I feel like so again with the psychological significance of the Exodus, when the chosen people are brought to the promised land and they see the giants and they say, "Oh no, we're not going to go. This is what God brought us through the desert to go here." And they say they're not going to go. I believe it's in anger at that that God says, "Well, you're gonna wander the desert for 40 years, and when you're all dead except 2 of you, your next generation will go in." And immediately after that, the Israelites say, "Oh, no, 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 we'll do it, we'll do it, we'll go right now." And God says, "No." There's like this really horrible, here's the purpose, here's the plan, here's the kingdom, here's the promise, and now you don't get to have it because you turned away from it right when you were about to get it or something like that. And now if perhaps what's happening with the psalmist is saying, okay, something like that, where it's like, okay, God's pushing us in this direction and it's going to be great, but now we've screwed up in a way. And so, maybe that can happen within the lifetime of a single individual. But if you're looking at the nation of Israel, it was actually an entire generation of people who had to live according to the faith that God would show up and be a part of the plan again, but that temporarily he's put the whole thing on hold. And, it didn't even matter that they changed their minds. That's a tough one. But then you could think like, okay, well, maybe there's something about the desert where you're supposed to learn the lesson of saying, um, now that God's no longer a part of the plan, we begged him to change his mind so we could just go do this thing right away. No, maybe what we need to do is build the sort of psychological attitude towards the divine that wouldn't make that mistake again in the future. And perhaps that took a generation with a nation, but I think of it as very similar to this thing that he's talking about with the psalmist, who's like, "Yeah, I screwed up," and now it's like, okay, when I screw up and God's wrestling with me about it, that's one thing. But when he just sort of walks off and say, "Okay, well, fine." And it's like, "No, I don't wanna go down that road." It's like, well, maybe what you need to do is develop the proper attitude so that when the opportunity is available again to engage with the divine, that you're not gonna make that mistake. And I'm going off on a tangent, but it's just a thought. Okay. Philosophers of science rightly assert that such an attitude toward the empirical is in principle illegitimate in the sciences. Okay, so the other thing to talk about is he's saying basically, empirically, you could verify faith, but you can't falsify it or refute it. Uh, I think that makes it non scientific or extra scientific. I mean, um, the entire setup that he's putting here is the sort of setup that would make a scientismist say, "Oh, well, that's exactly why I reject faith to begin with." It's the sort of thing that can never be proven wrong, no matter what happens. Therefore, the whole framework of the lens of those ideas is by definition useless because it can't tell you if you're living in this world or any of all the possible universes you could be living in. The whole point of a scientific idea is that it will distinguish. But what you're saying to me is no matter what evidence I can even imagine coming forward, it can fit in the box of God is talking to me or God is hiding his face from me. I don't think that's fair necessarily because and maybe for the reason why he's saying that it's empirically verifiable but not empirically refutable. However, that would be the attitude from the scientism perspective. They would be looking at his explanation here and saying that's precisely why these ideas are not useful to me. Okay, philosophers of science rightly assert that such an attitude toward the empirical is in principle illegitimate in the sciences. Okay, I just wasted a whole paragraph of talking to say the exact thing he's saying here. So he's aware of it. It is, however, hardly surprising that it should be of the essence of religious faith. Science is forever hypothetical. But what could one make of a religious faith which was forever hypothetical, wavering between belief in good times and unbelief in bad? Since, as we have seen, the characteristic of genuine faith is not only to survive in tragic times, but to survive in them most triumphant. It is no accident that adherents of biblical faith should always have regarded times of external or internal darkness not as evidence against God, but rather, to use Martin Buber's expression, as evidence of an quote, eclipse of God, unquote. To follow Buber's metaphor, an eclipse of the sun is something that occurs, not to. or in the sun, but between the sun and the eye. Moreover, this occurrence is temporary. Hence, the catastrophes of our time, however great, cannot by themselves account for the contemporary crisis of religious belief, or rather, they can be regarded as having produced this crisis only on the assumption that religious belief is already undermined. What then undermined it? Okay, so he's saying the same thing I was saying earlier, right? Nietzsche's saying, like, no, 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 the tragedies aren't making you doubt God's existence. I mean, it's one of the most common things in the history of religion. We're doing a lot of theology and the history of religion here. But one of the most common phenomena is that the more oppressed and persecuted, especially a young group of faith adherents, in a new fledgling faith are, the more rapidly the religion grows, right? So it doesn't even make sense that bad times would make you lose your faith, since that's just not what we see historically with religion. And he's saying, all right, look, the idea is that all these bad things have happened, so now we're questioning the existence of God. He says, no, that doesn't actually make sense. It might be the other way around, that we've lost our faith, and that's part of why all the bad things are happening. So he's hinting at that. All right. Hence, the catastrophes of our time, however great, cannot by themselves account for the temporary crisis of religious belief, or rather, they can be regarded as having produced this crisis only on the assumption that religious belief was already undermined. What then undermined it? Biblical faith and modern science. All right. He's going somewhere. Okay. Most people would say modern science. The story, remember we said Nietzsche said, "No, no, no, science is a subsection of Christianity," right? Okay, the story begins with Copernicus, who shows that the Earth is but one of many stars. It is carried forward by Darwin, who shows that man is but a higher animal, and it culminates with Freud, who shows that the one indubitably distinctive human characteristic, rationality, is neither very significant nor even very distinctive. Once at the center of the universe, man has been moved to the periphery. Once the crown of creation, man has become a fleck of dust. All right, so this is the other story for explaining it, right? Descartes comes along, we get the scientism rise, and so first of all, he's listing out the story the way it is, right? Science shows, hey, the Earth isn't the center of the universe, the solar system isn't the center of the universe, our galaxy isn't that particularly interesting, and all of the matter and energy that we see and interact with is like a less than 1% minority of what's minority of what's out there. And just further and further and further we get pushed to the periphery. It's not surprising that that happens, by the way. One of the fun things about the philosophy of science is that you can actually predict that that will happen, and it puts a lot of things that scientists say in a context. If you're banishing the subjective from consideration, the entire perspective of the universe through our eyes is the thing that you're pushing away. And so it's predictable that the next scientific revelation will also be Copernican. You don't have to wait for it. Right? You don't have to wait for it. That's the only direction science can go. It doesn't make the science wrong, and it doesn't make the science right, and it doesn't make us on the periphery affirmed by science. It's just like when you banish all subjectivity in order to do your work as a scientist, and then you sit there and you say, oh my gosh, I've been looking through my microscope and my telescope, and I've been measuring things through an electronic spectrogram, and I can't find free will and consciousness anywhere. Right, you banished consideration of those things. You can't think about those things because they're not objective, they're subjective, and then you're going, "Wow, I didn't find it. It must not exist." It's like, no, to do your game, and it's a great game and it's quite powerful, but to play that game, you have to first objectify everything. And then to say, "Well, I can't find it." It's been disproven. My science surely would have found it. It's like, no, your science can't be done unless you banish consideration of it from the beginning. Okay, so another and related aspect is perhaps still more important. The pre modern universe was shot through with value. There was a hierarchy of purposes into which man, with his human purposes, could fit and feel at home. Right? This is where we talk about the mythopoetic perspective, right? He said that's the way we used to think. That was almost granted to us. By contrast, the universe of modern science is a universe of fact without purpose. And because man cannot live without purpose, there arises a dichotomy between fact and value. How many people here have read Viktor Frankl? I'm sure at least one or two of you have.
I have.
Yeah, pretty dang good, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty insightful on someone who's experienced the Holocaust and doesn't doesn't have animosity towards the guards he sees, or he can see the human in them, regardless of the circumstances. He can see that by the circumstances that they're in, that it would be easier to do what they're doing than most would like to believe.
Remarkable. It's really remarkable. I mean, there's something, I mean, if we're slagging off scientism for a while, he's being quite an impressive scientist, right? He's really able to try to figure out what's true in a detached sort of a way and really stick to, what is shown with all the virtues of science while he's living through the most intense subjective experience, and then doing that with heart and with feeling and care and caring about the subjects that are suffering at the same time. I mean, he is got one foot in each realm, really solidly planted. And yeah, it's impressive. So I thought of it just because he's referencing, well, man can't live without meaning here, can't live without purpose. It's like, well, okay, so that's the main thesis of one half of his book. For those of you who haven't read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, it's highly, highly, highly recommended by everybody who's ever read it, as far as I can tell. And like Savad was saying, so he wrote like I think a 20-volume work. He was a psychologist, and he wrote like 20 volumes on how to think about the human mind and to do clinical psychology. And the Nazis burned his books and threw him in a concentration camp, and he lived with the purpose through the concentration camp. He had the purpose of one day getting out and rewriting his books, and he did that. There's a very small book called Man's Search for Meaning, which half of the book is a record of his time and the psychological insights he had into his fellow prisoners and to the guards and all sort. It's really profound stuff. I mean, um, it's shocking. Uh, And he has a real lot of ethos. I mean, one of the things he says is when we got out of the camps, there were many former prisoners who were abysmally rude and unkind to everyday people that they met. And he says their psychological justification was, "You don't know what I've been through." And he also made the insight that the cruelest people in the camps were the prisoners who were appointed as guards over other prisoners. That the Nazi soldiers weren't as cruel to the Jewish prisoners as whatever Jewish prisoner lackey they appointed to be in charge. So he's making unflattering and very hard to observe things. Like he's observing them with his eyes open and he's reporting them, and it's a heck of a book. I remember there were pages of that book where every line I felt like he was just smacking me in the head with like really profound truths. It's a heck of a good book. And then the other half of that book is sort of the short version summary of his 20-volume thesis for how to approach psychotherapy. So it's a real adrenaline shot version of all of that. And he's got really fantastic stories in there. The one that struck me the most was the old gentleman. You'll probably remember this, Savad. The old man who came into his office one day, knocked on the door, opened the door, and Dr. Frankel, and he says, "Yeah, come in." He says, "Well, how can I help you?" He said, "Well, my friends told me I got to come see you because well, they said I got to come see you." And he says, "Well, why? Why is that?" He goes, "Well, I'm really depressed. I'm unhappy. I'm sad, and they're sick to death of having me around because I'm such a drag. So they told me to come see you." He says, "All right, well, what's going on?" He says, "Well, my wife died 2 years ago, and he's like an 87-year-old man. He said, "We were married like 60 years, and she was everything to me, and I just wake up every morning and I don't know why I'm alive, and I don't think there's any meaning in life anymore because, you know, she's gone now, and we did everything together." And Viktor Frankl's theory was that you can't solve anybody's problems as a psychotherapist. What you can do is help them to sort out their situation, and that man is searching for meaning. So he said of the Holocaust survivors, he said we were prisoners, and we would look at a man and we'd say he's going to be dead in 3 days. And he says you could just tell that he had given up hope and he had no meaning, and you could just sort of predict it. And then, sure enough, the person would be dead in a few days. But that he knew people who kept they had a purpose and a reason for surviving. And I mean, we don't want to make it too simplified or anything, and he certainly doesn't. But he says, I think it's from Viktor Frankl, where he underlines the Nietzschean idea that a man can survive any how if he only has a why.
The same could be said of POWs in Vietnam, or I get any
Right.
POWs that are captured, is that they would be able to identify those who would make it or not. So, like you said, very quickly, if they didn't have a if they didn't have a why.
It's a weird thing. It's a weird thing to observe because you can imagine being a decent human being in that situation and just sort of blinding yourself to things instead of observing them because it's so horrible. But yeah, so he made those observations, and then his idea of psychotherapy was that you can talk out and ask questions and help the person to discover the meaning that they're blind to. Like they need to find the meaning for their suffering, and you can't give it to them, but you can help them talk it out. So he says to the old gentleman, he said, "Did you love your wife?" He says, "Oh my God, she was everything to me every day. We did everything together. She was my light and my purpose." And he goes on and on. And he says, "Okay, good. Did did your wife love you?" "Oh, man, I was everything to her. She woke up, the sun rose for me. We spent all our day together. We did everything." Like he goes like this, says, "Okay." He says, "So how is it for you living now that your wife is dead?" I said, "I'm telling you, doc, it's terrible. There's no purpose. There's no meaning. I don't see why I should do anything. The light in my life is gone, and everything is suffering, and it's for no reason as far as I can tell." And then Viktor Frankl's just asking him questions. He says, "What would it be like for your wife if you had died instead of her?" "Oh my God, that would be terrible. She'd be so miserable. She would find no purpose, and she'd think that like life wasn't worth living. Oh my God, she'd be suffering like I am right now." And then Viktor Frankl says, "So is it possible that the reason why you're going through this great suffering is so that she doesn't have to?" And then in the book, he says, "The man straightened his back, looked me in the eyes, shook my hand, said, 'Thank you, doc,' and walked out of the room." It's hard to even retell that story without getting teary-eyed or choked up, but, so anyway, it's a great book. In any case, we're going off on lots of fun tangents today, but, if you haven't read it, it's a short book and it's really good. Okay. Values are now human only. Man finds that he and his values have no counterpart in the world of sheer fact around him. He is radically alone. When Aristotle gazed at the stars, he could regard them as manifesting purposes somehow akin to human purposes. When the stranger of Albert Camus' novel gazes at the stars, he must regard them as neutral. Thus, it seems that man is not only a marginal being within the universe of modern science, but also that his purposes and values, inextricably bound up with any conceivable religion, lack the kind of objective warrant which could be given them by some some Archimedean point outside himself. How then can he still look upon himself as being under the special care of a cosmic deity? But this whole argument, however plausible on the surface, is utterly invalid, since biblical belief is empirically irrefutable. Scientific evidence can no more affect it than the evidence of historical tragedy or the evidence of an empty heart. The biblical God, to be sure, has always revealed himself, but he has always concealed himself as well. At most, therefore, modern science should have no greater effect on biblical belief than to show that its God was even more inscrutable than had hitherto been thought, and his revelations even more ambiguous and intermittent. I like this guy. He's seeing quite clearly. All right. Perhaps, however, it would be rash to dismiss the threat of modern science to biblical faith on such general grounds alone. Conceivably, there is a special affinity between that faith and the Weltanschauung of the pre-modern world. Okay, well, we have to look up German words here, so hold on a second. I'm unfamiliar with this. Let's see what this German word means. Okay. A particular philosophy or view of life, the worldview. It just means worldview of an individual or group. Welt. Sounds about right. Okay, we'll add that to the list of German inspired English words, words adopted into English from German. And conceivably of the very different Weltanschauung that goes with modern science is radically in conflict with biblical faith. Science may be unable to refute faith, yet it may be that one cannot really live by both. But it is true. All right, so that's a good point, right? It's similar to the point I was making before. If in order to do science, you have to take a certain perspective, which banishes consideration of subjective things, which a lot of things are subjective, including purpose and intention and all sorts of things. If those just have to be banished in order to make any progress in science, he's saying, well, then that first he's saying, well, then therefore science can't come to a conclusion that would make you lose your faith. So why would we think that this argument is plausible that the reason why we're in a faith crisis is that science has refuted God? It can't do anything like that. And he says, but maybe because you have to take that perspective to begin with, it's too hard for people to praise that approach and then accept things that would be unprovable by that approach. He says, but is it true that pre-modern science and biblical faith are temperamentally compatible, while modern science and biblical faith are mutually hostile? Whitehead argues, and argues plausibly, that the opposite is the case. According to Whitehead, pre-modern and modern science differ not only in their conclusions about nature, but also in their approach to nature. Pre-modern science did not experiment with torture nature. Who would wish to torture something divine or shot through with divinity? It was because they regarded nature as divine that the Greeks thought only of contemplating it and not of putting it into human use. Thus, though they developed so much else, they never systematically developed experimentation. To the Protestant mind, schooled in the Bible, nature is not divine, but the work of God, and God created it for the human use. It was this belief, still according to Whitehead, that made modern experimental science possible. Hence, one might well conclude that in some ways, modern science is closer in spirit to biblical faith than its pre modern predecessor. All right, quick comment on that. That was exactly what Nietzsche said, right? Nietzsche said, "Look, you can thank witchcraft and you can thank Christianity for modern science," and it was precisely the Christian idea that there's a carpenter's workbench, and on it is this very fancy clockwork thing that's been built, and God is outside of that thing. And so God has created this world, and you can learn about how rational and ingenious He is by studying the world, but also you can sort of take on that God perspective of seeing it as just object, which made it possible for people to imagine trying to look at the world in that way to do that kind of science. I mean, for Nietzsche, that was a completely crazy way of looking at being because we're actually in it, and you're not taking a perspective that you actually have a right to hold, so long as you're pretending to have that perspective. That was one of his many points about it. Um, I think I might very minorly just highlight a disagreement here, which is I actually think that the pre-scientific way of understanding Christianity and the mythopoetic was more true to the scriptures, right? So he's saying that it's he's seeing that biblical faith in the modern era is goes right along with scientific thinking, just like Nietzsche said. But then he says, so therefore, why should science and faith be so at odds with each other when really it's the pre-modern predecessor of the pre-modern predecessor of science. He's basically talking about that mythopoetic way of seeing nature as infused with personality and as constituted in some sort of a pantheon of deities in relationship to each other that we have to relate to properly, right? All of that's subjective. All of that's it's we would call it personification. They would look at us and say, why are you objectifying everything? But it's all from that perspective. I think that's actually a more accurate perspective for the correct faith. And Nietzsche's point was, yeah, God was murdered by the heart of Christianity. Christianity evolved into this thing that killed belief in God because it became this scientific kind of a thing. So anyway, let's see where he goes with it. Is there not rivalry between a science which finds gods in nature and a faith whose God is beyond nature? And is not a science for which nature is at any right undivine, free from conflict with a faith which, however different in all other respects, agrees at least on this one point. Nevertheless, it might still remain true that this undivine nature of modern science threatens, excuse me, if it does not rule out any religious recourse to a divinity beyond nature. If man is a mere fleck of dust in a blind universe, can he plausibly resort to such a God, furthermore, essentially concerned with him? But closer inspection reveals that this is, and has been since the rise of modern science, only half the story. As the object of scientific investigation, man may be infinitely small. As the subject undertaking the investigation, however, he is infinitely large, if only because he knows that he is infinitely small. Man, growing ever smaller in stature as modern science progressed, at the same time grew ever larger as well. For whereas all else in the universe was only part of a whole, it was man who knew the whole and his own position within it. And so far as we can tell, even today, man is unique in this respect. What makes him unique, moreover, is not a mere capacity for abstract theory, which is relevant to a few thinkers alone. It is the power this capacity gives him to transform nature as well as to transform the whole human condition. Because of technology, man can be more fully controlled than ever before. He becomes the object of physical and social engineering, but the engineer is himself human. I hope it is clear that my purpose is not to exalt human greatness in an attempt, like those of earlier times, to struggle by means of faith in man towards faith in God. Rather, what I want to stress is man's dialectical condition. It's pretty well highlighted, I would say, by what he said. That he is at once small and large, part of the universe, and yet not reducible to a mere part. In short, and for better or worse, a terror, wonder, and mystery to himself. Now, in this regard, modern man is not really so far from the psalmist who writes, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou shouldst think of him? Yet hast thou made him but little lower than the angels, and crowned him with honor and glory." It is, to be sure, a decisive difference that the psalmist feels, at once small and large before God. His feeling and ours, however, have much in common. If then the historical catastrophes of our time cannot explain the crisis of contemporary religious belief, neither can modern science in all its works. Indeed, one might go so far as to say that the whole battle between science and religion rests on nothing but gigantic misunderstandings on both sides. It was because faith had already been undermined by the time this battle was joined in the 19th century that religion had to resort either to a fundamentalism hostile to all science or else to a modernism seeking props for its own weakness in a science which would not and could not provide them. All right, so let's see where he thinks this eclipse is really starting from, because he doesn't think it comes from catastrophe nor from science. Biblical faith versus subjective reductionism. Our question concerning the cause of the modern crisis of faith thus remains unanswered. In seeking the answer, we do well to keep a firm grasp on the essence of biblical faith, which is the believer's certainty of standing in relation to an unprovable and irrefutable God. What could have undermined such a certainty? The process was extremely complex, but let us, for the sake of better understanding, try to describe it as though it took place in three clearly distinct stages. First, came what may be called the discovery of the circle of authority and faith. A pre modern man, if asked about the grounds of his religious certainty, would presumably have pointed to an authority, a prophet, a sacred scripture, a church, even the voice of his own heart. This, however, involves a circle. If Moses beheld the presence of God in the burning bush, it was because he was already open to that presence. A modern agnostic, beholding the same bush, would perceive only a chemical phenomenon. No conceivable datum, neither a natural fact nor an inner experience, nor an existing scripture can serve as an authority authenticating a religious truth except for those already prepared to accept that truth on faith. Faith may base itself on authority, but the authority is an authority only where faith can be presumed. Well, this is interesting. The discovery of this circle is not by itself fatal to faith, as can be seen from the fact that pre-modern thinkers were by no means wholly unaware of it. St. Thomas Aquinas knew, for example, that he could not argue with a non-believer on the basis of revealed scripture, since the issue between them was precisely whether the scriptures were revealed. Nevertheless, the discovery, by focusing attention on faith instead of on authority, leads the modern critic to a second and more decisive step. To the believer, faith is the immediate relation between himself and God. To the critic, faith is merely the feeling of standing in such a relation, plus an inference from that feeling to an actual God. The step just described may seem a matter of mere philosophical subtlety, yet everything centers around it. For once this second step is taken, the third, and it is the coup de grace, quickly follows. The elimination, with the help of Occam's razor, of the inferred God. Occam asserted the rational necessity of eliminating unnecessary assumptions as one shaves off an unwanted beard. And it is all too clear that God, as an assumption made to account for the feeling of his presence, is indeed both unwanted and unnecessary. In the first place, a God inferred to explain religious feelings would at most be a probable inference, capable of refutation and never really certain. And in the second place, anyone in agreement with Kant and with a good many other philosophers as well would regard such an inference, moving from a natural effect to a supernatural cause, as in principle illegitimate. Thus, modern criticism, operating through three stages, explains faith as an inference from religious feeling and eliminates the inference as a redundancy. To complete the destruction of faith, it remains only to explain. So, should we pause? Because this is pretty powerful what he's saying here. Now I'll finish the paragraph. To complete the destruction of faith, it remains only to explain how the inference should ever have been mistaken for an immediate relationship. That is achieved by defining God as, in fact, an unconscious projection, and faith as, in fact, a solitary disport with religious feelings. These things, however, these in turn are to be explained. The reason we can consider this whole process, which may be termed subjectivist reductionism, as the cause of the modern religious crisis is that it is not a mere intellectual argument carried on by abstract thinkers. Subjectivist reductionism has become a modern, perhaps the modern, way of life. Which came first, the argument or the way of life? We need not here inquire. All right, so the first thing to notice is that there's something actually um, reminiscent of his point earlier that the scientific worldview would have you not postulate hypotheses without reason. And so it sort of is hinted at that perhaps our commitment to that way of thinking is a part of the problem. But in short, what he's saying is this: forget modern science, forget all the catastrophes of the 20th century. The reason why people have trouble believing in God and there's a crisis of faith is that faith was thought by them to be the evidence of their relationship with a God, that they would have a feeling that they were in relationship to something outside themselves. And from that feeling, they would infer that there was something outside themselves. But our modern subjectivist reductionism, as he calls it, takes that apart in three steps and says, okay, so you've got a feeling. Why are you postulating that there's something that you're feeling? It's just you have a feeling. It's a projection. It's a part of what it means to be human. It's nothing special. It's you think you're in relationship with something outside yourself, but you have no evidence that there's something outside yourself. You just know that you're the sort of creature that feels that way. It's wonderful for perhaps maybe it's the best way to live is according to those feelings, but it doesn't make me think there's actually someone there that you're relating to. He thinks that's the core psychological crisis in our culture and in individuals that is making them um, use Occam's razor to cut off all of the well, why would I postulate a supernatural being? It's so complicated and there's so much to it. Why do I think I can prove all of that just because I know that I feel like I'm in relationship with that? I feel like I'm in relationship with it. That's no reason to think it's real. Does anybody want to interject anything there? That's his horrible crisis that we're in. That's the way he highlights it. Says that's the situation we're in today. Well, there's a few things we could say. One, Descartes, in his proof for the existence of God, does precisely this. He says, I can find within myself a relationship in just the ideas in my head. I might not even be a body. I could be in the matrix. I could be a bit of computer code. Whatever I am, I have ideas. There are ideas. I'm a thinking thing. And so, at least as a thinking thing, I exist and I have some ideas. And then he looks at the quality of some of those ideas and he says, the nature of this idea is inexplicable if it comes from me. He actually rules that out. He says, this can't be something that I made up because the quality of this idea is something that's not like anything I am. I know myself to be flawed. I'm not infinite. I'm not simple and yet all powerful. I'm not, you know, I'm flawed. And yet I have an idea of something that's perfect and yet is simple. It's not complicated. It doesn't have parts and sides. It's just this simple, pure, perfect thing. And I know I'm not like that. And furthermore, I know that I've never interacted with anything like that. As far as even if all of my experiences in the world are just a dream, everything I've ever experienced is limited by the rules of temporality and spatiality, and nothing I've ever witnessed is like the nature of this idea. I've discovered I have an idea in my mind that I can think about, which is so different, right? Like, I know I've seen a rhinoceros and I've seen a horse, and I can imagine a unicorn because I've seen a horse and I've seen a horned creature, and so I can just put them together. But this thing is unlike anything I've ever seen. All of the things I've ever experienced, none of them are like this. So the quality of this idea means that it didn't come to me from what I am, and it didn't come to me from anything I've ever interacted with, right? I've seen gold, I've seen a mountain, I can imagine a gold mountain. But now I'm talking about something that's unlike everything. Where did I get that idea from? It didn't come from me. It didn't come from anything I've interacted with. The only possibility is that there must be something like that out there that left its fingerprint on me so that I could relate to it. It's the only explanation for why there has to be something like that that's the source of my idea of it. So we don't have to get into that in detail right now. We will in when we do the focus on Descartes in the second year. But that's his argument for God's existence. Nietzsche, interestingly enough, because everybody likes to attack Descartes for his proof of God's existence. How can you just sit there as an idea? Oh, there's an idea in your head that proves that God exists. It seems like a shell game or something. And most people like to take it apart. Nietzsche famously said, no, Descartes' right. He said, if I think therefore I am is reliable, then everything else follows. And he thought perfectly through all of it. Um, Now, the other thing to notice, I'm sorry, Sivan, please.
Well, I was going to say, well, you had shared, how is that something I can recognize because it is right something I'm not. I think, with some cultures, they were able to at least recognize, pattern wise, uh, the sky, depending on where their culture, where they were, if they're on a shoreline and they're on the sea and it's endless and they can't see to the other side, they would say, wow, it's infinite. It is much larger than anything we have or we could recognize. I suppose that could be a stepping stone of the stars. The sky is endless. It seems to go on forever.
All right, so we should pull up Descartes to look at it because he's a very very thorough thinker. He addresses it, the idea that the nature of this idea of his is just removing of limitations, right? So everything I see is limited. I just get rid of the limitations, and now it's boundless, and that's where I got my idea from. I took away limitations. I didn't have to interact with something that was boundless in order to have that idea. I just extrapolate it, basically, right? Is that the notion?
Right, but then I suppose it's the boundaries that enable survival as well, right? There needs to be some structure in place. Hunters and get There needs to be structure in place, right? So hunters and gatherers, there needs to be a certain way you go about hunting and when you hunt so you can eat. It isn't you have this endless amount of time to just go about that as you'd like because you wouldn't be able to survive and your tribe would cease to exist.
Right. So it's the limitations that make everything real.
Right.
Everything's real because even the universe that seems boundless, it's 13.8 billion years. You can find the edge. It's not real if there isn't a boundary, right? A circle is only real because of the line that tells you where it no longer is. It's inside here is the circle, outside here is not. Those boundaries make it real. And Descartes says that's true of everything you've ever experienced. But he takes you into meditation to find an idea in your mind. And he says, I've got an idea. It's a really clear idea. I can meditate on this idea. I can relate to it. I can interact with it. I can dwell upon it. And this idea is not like that. It's completely unlimited and yet simple. It's not really, really big. It's outside of being by the definition of its limitation, which, it's like bigger than big or not big at all or something like that. It's unlike anything I've ever experienced. So where did I get the notion? Right? If I said it was gold, I'd say, well, I've interacted with gold before. If I say it's mountainous, I would say, well, I've interacted with mountains, bigger mountains and smaller mountains, but they're all limited by the valleys on either side. But what is this unlimited thing that seems simple and that I can relate to? Where the hell did I get that idea from in the first place? I'm not like that. I've made mistakes. I'm not outside of error. I'm not boundless. So I didn't get the idea from myself. It seems impossible to even imagine that I could have interacted with anything like that since it doesn't seem to make any sense to me that something could be like that. Incidentally, he plagiarized this entire thing from Socrates, who, which I don't shouldn't say plagiarized, but this entire argument that Descartes is putting forward is just straightforwardly in some of the stuff that Socrates is talking about. Um, so wait, why did we get on this? We got on this because let's see here.
It was Occam's razor.
Oh, right, 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 right. So again, what he's saying about the subjectivist reductionism is that what we're saying is that, well, I've got a feeling that I'm relating to God, and so I infer that there's a God, and now my reductivism is telling me, well, you shouldn't be making that step because what evidence do you have that there actually is something out there like that? And I thought, well, Descartes made the argument for that, and Socrates actually did too, which is that. Uh, you are relating to an idea, the very nature of the idea makes it impossible that you could be relating to it unless there's something like that somehow. That thing must be real for you to have an impression of it because it's so unlike what you know yourself to be and what you know everything else to be. Um, the other thing that would be a fun digression is to talk about. I've heard some philosophers say that Occam's razor is not a very good principle. You hear certain people talk about it like it's unquestionably a good principle. Christopher Hitchens used to cite it all the time and reference it as like, "Oh, of course, Occam's razor, dispense of needless hypotheses." I remember creating a thought experiment for a professor in philosophy who's a friend of mine, and I said, "All right, let's imagine," because I don't think AI is real, by the way, but I said, "Let's imagine there's AI. Let's imagine it's the singularity of AI, and it's super genius, and what it can do is on Tuesday, we ask it to come up with a grand unified theory of everything based on all of the data. In fact, we even plug it into things that can run experiments and interact with the world. So it's getting all of the data it can possibly need, and it comes up with a total theory of everything that explains the outcome of any experiment we could ever imagine putting together, and it gets it all correct. Say, okay, now we've got the theory that we've been looking for, that we've been trying to get to, that we might be close to. We've got it. The AI gave it to us, but it's really, really complicated how it got there. And you could spend 1,000 years studying it and you wouldn't really understand it. But it's very simple formulas and you can use them and you can make all the predictions that you want to understand the world. Okay, that's a fun thought experiment. They said, okay, now imagine on Wednesday it comes up with 12 other theories that also explain absolutely the outcome of every experiment you could ever put together. And none of them, and they all contradict each other. They're just completely different theories that work. Now we have a plethora, we have a surplus of things. We were hoping to get to one of them, but now we've got 3 weeks later, 12,000 different theories, none of which we could fully understand, even if we spent our lifetime studying them, all of which give us simple formulas that make sense of everything. I said, well, Occam's razor is used because we say, well, why don't we just use the simplest to remember one, the simplest formulas? Let's not make things more complicated than they have to be. If this explains everything that we understand, well, then we'll just use that formula. It's the easiest one to teach, it's the easiest one to remember. But if we had riches of explanation, might we not have to set up a new standard? Like, let's find the most complicated or the most aesthetically pleasing or the one that speaks the most to our poetic inclinations or like the Occam's razor thing won't be useful anymore because we won't be able to actually comprehend any of these theories. We just have formulas that work. And you say, well, I got to program the computer to run the math. I put in the variables and it gives me an answer. But, I could do that with any of these 12,000 different theories, and some of them have more complicated math and some have simpler math, but they all give me the answer in a billionth of a second whenever I plug in any variables. And so, well, why should I pick the one? Maybe I should pick the one that codes the easiest, right? Like the Occam's razor thing is sort of only useful if we're in a dearth of comprehension. Anyway, it's a thought. None of it. These are a lot of digressions, so we probably shouldn't do them forever, but they're fun to think about. So let's see where he goes with this. So we now understand what he thinks. He thinks it's not the catastrophes of the 20th century. It's not even scientism or science that makes us have this crisis of faith. He says it's this philosophical subjective reductionism that makes us say, why am I postulating that there's actually a God I'm relating to? Maybe my relationship with God is just my conversation with a projected part of myself. I have feelings, I have inclinations that aren't related to me interacting with you or me interacting with nature, but me interacting with the divine. And maybe that's just a part of being human, is that you have this delusion or you have this divine spark, but that doesn't mean there's a fire of the gods somewhere. It's just we have a bunch of little sparks. And why are you postulating something more than that? He says that's the thing we can't shake out of our heads. And again, I think there are philosophers like Descartes and Socrates who address that already. But let's see what he says. The reason we can consider this whole process, which may be termed subjective reductionism, as the cause of the modern religious crisis is that it is not a mere intellectual argument carried on by abstract thinkers. Subjectivist reductionism, again, it's kind of that scientism ethos. Okay. Much that passes for an independent assault on religion is actually a version or an application of the three-stage argument just presented. Consider first biblical criticism, which it is sometimes supposed constitutes a refutation of the claim that the scriptures are the revealed word of God. But in fact, biblical criticism either presupposes what it imagines itself to be proving, or else it leaves the issue open. For if the critic declares that what the Bible itself regards as the reflection of human dialogues with God is nothing more than an expression of the evolution of religious feelings and ideas, it is he who has brought such categories to the Bible, not the Bible which has yielded them to him. His criticism, in other words, already assumes a position of subjectivist reductionism. Okay. Consider next humanism. Feuerbach, possibly the greatest of modern humanists, speaks for all. He says, quote, "What man is not, but wills to be or wishes to be, just that and only that, nothing else is God. But to the religious believer, God is not what he wills to be. He is the other than human with whom the believer stands in relation. How then does the humanist refute the believer? Only by a form of subjectivist reductionism. And what is true of Feuerbach is true of Marx and Freud as well. To unmask some gods as pseudo gods, they can rely on specific empirical evidence in specific spheres. But to unmask all gods as pseudo gods is, in the end, to rest one's case not on specific empirical evidence, but on an a priori philosophical argument. And the argument is a form of subjectivist reductionism. Okay, so he's saying the thing that we've heard a lot of Christian apologists say, which is that there's got to be something circular at the base. There's got to be something a priori. There's got to be just a starting point of faith that you have. For the religious believer, they believe that there is a divine that they should be in relationship with. For all of the other camps of critics, he says your reinterpretation of my experience with the divine ultimately is reducible to the exact same thing or something analogous to what it is that you are attacking me for, right? I'm starting with the starting point that there's a divine I need to relate to, and then I'm interpreting my interactions and feelings with this divine as evidence that there actually is that thing. You're coming with a different lens. You're saying, well, it's psychological projection, or it's class warfare, or it's this, or it's that. And you're starting with that as your faith position and interpreting everything that way, but you didn't find evidence that that's the case. That's just your preferred lens for interpreting things. And at the bottom, it's just like if I say, well, the Bible is the word of God because it claims to be. It's like, well, that's not a very convincing argument. But if you say, well, the Bible is ultimately the expression of human beings' aspirational goals for what they might become. You didn't find that in a microscope. There's no empirical reason to believe that. That's just the lens that you use to interpret things, and it's no more convincing an argument than any other starting point a priori faith position is what he's trying to suggest, I think. So, so persuasive is subjectivist reductionism in the modern world that it has enlisted friends of religion as well as foes in its ranks. Although it must be said that this friendship is of the most dubious kind. Its nature may be illustrated by two examples, the one widespread and popular, the other more or less confined to academics. Pragmatism And a good deal of popular psychology as well is apt to assert that while religious beliefs are mere wish or need projections, they are useful or even necessary for comfortable survival in an uncomfortable world. The question thus arises as to how they can be preserved, and the answer would appear to be, quote, would appear to be something like by keeping their illusory character concealed. For who can live by a belief which he knows to be illusory? Yet such concealment is not only practically impossible in the modern world, the particular friends of religion presently under consideration do not even seem to desire it. Hence, in many circles, religion has become a collective make believe, something which is good for most, accepted as true by others, rejected as false by oneself. Religion of this sort is not a bulwark against religious crisis, it is one of its gravest manifestations. Much the same can be said of the other more academic forms of friendship for religion displayed by some of the linguistic philosophers who have now taken over from the logical positivists. Logical positivism was a clear foe of religious belief, of religious faith. It declared religious language to be emotive only, right? This is these linguistic people. Right. So, what that means is that, to say I believe in God is not to make a statement of even your belief. It's to say God, yay, or I think that we shouldn't sin is really just to say murder, boo, something like that, right? It's not a statement of even a proposition that you believe. What it is like a collective or a public verbal vote, yes or no, which is or something like that. Um, so so let's continue to see what he says about this. Thus, God really means three cheers for the world. And a revivalist preacher urging his congregation to give three cheers for God was really saying, let's give three cheers for the world. Here was subjective reductionism accompanied by forthright hostility. The heirs of logical positivism, the linguistic philosophers, on the whole, feel no such hostility. Science tells us about the world, they say, while religion reflects attitudes toward the world. And why should we not have attitudes? Indeed, how can we live without them? But if religion is acknowledged to be an attitude only, and the God toward whom religion is an attitude is excluded, then subjectivist reductionism has won the day. Defending the attitude as attitude does not protect religious faith, it helps bring about its doom. Mark's power went out and his phone is at 2%. Okay, sorry, Mark. Um, okay. So let's pause here. I'm not sure. Well, let's see what else he has to say, but I'm not sure that pragmatism ends quite where he says it ends. Um, but essentially, he's set up two different types of embracers of his what he's calling subjectivist reductionism who are on the faith side. And the first group he says are the pragmatists who say, look, we get it. It's just useful to believe in God. But that's all it is useful. Now, of course, the pragmatists think that what is useful is true. And so maybe he missed that, or maybe I'm wrong about that, or whatever. But I'm not sure I totally take his take on pragmatism here. But what he's saying is there's a type of person who says, look, it's not true in the true sense of true, but it's useful. So what we should do is pretend it's true and try to help people to still believe it's true. And that'll be useful. And then he says the linguistic people, they actually say, look, no, it's not that it's not true. It's just that it's not expressing something which could be true or false. It's expressing attitudes towards being. And attitudes are a fine thing to have. But he thinks that neither of these approaches would save what he calls religious faith, because he says, look, if you reduced belief in God to an attitude, well, that's fine so long as you recognize that your attitude has nothing to say about whether or not there actually is such a God, right? So you can keep your belief in God so long as it's not a belief in a proposition anymore. It's just that's my attitude. I guess you can have an attitude and wonderful for you, but he doesn't see any life for faith there. Uh, we'll comment on whether or not he's mixing up few things, but okay, we get what he's discussing there. All right, so we only have a short bit left. I was going to say we should finish this next time, but let's just try to push through real quickly. Buber's restatement of biblical faith. Has subjectivist reductionism then won the day? It has not. For the biblical faith has been restated in our time, both by Jews and Christians, with a purity perhaps unmatched in centuries, and this restatement has fully risen to the challenge posed by subjectivist reductionism. Here are two quotations, one taken from Bertrand Russell's My Philosophical Development, the other from Buber's Eclipse of God. Russell writes, if A loves B, the relation consists in certain states of mind of A. Even an atheist must admit that a man can love God. It follows that love of God is a state of the man who feels it and not properly a relational fact. All right, so that's a pretty good picture of his reductionist um, subjectivism, right? Contrast this with Buber, who says, great images of God fashioned by mankind are born, not of imagination, but of real encounters with divine power and glory. All right, so these are about as antithetical to one another as they can be. Russell here admirably states the subjectivist reductionist view, although he expressly speaks only of the love of God, which he says would apply equally well to faith. Just as an atheist can, quote, admit that a man can love God, he can admit faith in another man. Faith would be a subjective state, and God would become an inference made by the believer, which the atheist would declare invalid. Buber's statement, once contrasted with Russell's, is seen in its full significance and polemic power. Man does not have private feelings from which he infers the divine. If related to God at all, he is primordially open to him, and his subjective feelings and the images of God he fashions are mere byproducts of this primordial openness. All right, that he put in italics. It's his own words. Let's read it again. This is his formula of the most bold, he says, restatement of faith that rivals anything we've heard for centuries. He says, if related to God at all, man is primordially open to him. So from the very pre-molecular structure of what you are, like the very nature of your being is something that was fashioned with a capacity to relate to God. And your subjective feelings and the images of God that you fashion are mere byproducts of this primordial openness. No doubt man can be imprisoned by images and feelings, and no doubt he can seek to escape from the prison of these images and feelings by inferring from them to a God beyond them. But such imprisonment is pseudo religion, and the attempt to escape from it is futile. Or rather, the true escape is not to infer God from images and feelings, but to turn away from these to God Himself. Right? So, from Buber's perspective, there is a God. You are relating to him. Your images could be a little off. You could make idols out of them, whatever, but they're the product of the fact that you are the sort of thing that is in communication with the divine. That's how you came to be, is through that process. That's what you are at the bottom of the soles of your feet. You're that type of thing. On Buber's thesis, an atheist can certainly, quote, admit that a man can love God. But it is questionable whether an atheist can do something far more important, understand what the love of God means. For how can he distinguish between the pseudo love, which, being feeling only, is a disguised love of self, and the real love which obtains between God and man? And what holds of the distinction between love and pseudo love also holds of the distinction between great images of God and trivial or superficial ones. Perhaps the atheist does not wholly lack the power to make these distinctions, but then not everyone protesting atheism is a simple and unequivocal atheist. Here we have then two assertions. How are we to judge between them? All right, so these are two assertions. And we've been dealing with reduction with subjectivist reductionism the whole time. So we have two assertions. One is There's nothing to this God thing. You feel like you're relating to him, but why propound hypotheses? Why assume that there's a thing you're relating to? You're just the sort of creature that has those sorts of feelings. And then there's this other side which says, oh, it's the exact opposite. You are the sort of thing that is in relationship with the divine. Therefore, you have impressions of him and images of him, and those are sometimes flawed. And by definition, you're in the mean between this perfection and non-being. And so none of it is perfectly understood, but it's those things are the byproduct of your relationship with the divine because that is what you are in your nature. Now, he says, how are we to judge between those two perspectives? I will approach this decisive question through a perennial problem, though it can carry us only to the threshold of an answer. Philosophers often ask how one can know other minds. I can immediately know my own feelings, and I can immediately observe other people's behavior. But how can I know the feelings of others? Well, I can infer them from their behavior. But this inference would seem to presuppose that their behavior is like mine, that, for example, they behave when they feel pain as I do when I feel pain. This assumption may be perfectly plausible, but it is an assumption. Hence, I can never know, and certainly never know immediately, that I am not radically alone. Right? This is the philosophical problem of other minds. Say, how do you know you're not just dreaming everything, or how do you know that anybody's not just a robot, right? A mindless zombie. They behave in the same sort of way that you behave, and you can make inferences that they're having something like the internal existence that you think you're having, but you can never really know it. He says, how do you not fall into solipsism? He says, well, let's deal with that problem. I am persuaded that while this line of reasoning has some value in bringing to light certain specific philosophical issues, it is altogether misguided. A self is primordially open to other selves. And unless it were thus open, it would never become a self at all. Ooh, this is going to get interesting. A child becomes an I in a relation of openness to a thou. Indeed, he knows the meaning of thou before he knows the meaning of I. There is, to be sure, a problem involved in knowing other selves, but the problem is not whether they exist, it is who they are. And it arises not because the self is to begin with in a subjectivist prison from which it must subsequently try to escape. It arises because, born free of persons of this kind, the self is subsequently cast into them by the breakdown of communication. And when the breakdown is complete, there is mental disease. Well, now there is a really fun reframing of the whole problem. He says, oh, I know that I exist, but how do I know that other minds are like mine? He goes, no, you, you only know that you exist because primordially, at your very base, you are in relationship to others. Right? And he takes the example of the development of the notion of the self in the infant. He says that the child knows of others before he knows that he is a thing himself. And if you couldn't be like, if, in other words, you can do a Socratic kind of a thing here. You can say, well, or a Cartesian sort of a thing. You can say, what do I know about myself? Okay, I'm in this solipsistic prison. Oh no, it's just me and I'm dreaming all the time. Well, it's all made up. So, okay, well, what kind of a thing is it that's dreaming? Well, it's a kind of a thing that knows itself as an entity. Okay, how did it get there? He says, well, if you understand it, it had to get there through relationship with other entities. There's no other way that you could know yourself except in smashing up against other characters. Go ahead.
An example of right a child of recognizing the thou before the I is the first time they see themselves in a mirror.
Yeah. I'm sure that there's some sort of other way of developing it if there are no mirrors, but that's probably the
Right,
first
right.
time.
Over time, the development of self, but the first time they observe themselves of, oh, that's me moving or my facial expressions.
They know mama and they know dada. They even know the words mama and dada
Mhm.
before they know that they are a person, is what he's saying.
Right.
right? And so it's like, okay, the I is not a thing that can exist on its own. It has to be an I thou relationship that allows the I to even be a formulated notion in the first place. And if you lose that, you're going to have mental disease pretty quickly and everything's going to break down. You can't maintain an I that is alone. So he's saying what he's saying is that in the fundamental primordial base of being, for what sort of a creature you are a relational creature. Okay. So that's his analogy for how he's going to deal with this God question. This much, at least, would seem arguable or even demonstrable. Genuine love between humans does not consist of subjectivist solitudes externally related. It is one relation, although always impaired in its unity, often threatened by temporary eclipse and sometimes by total destruction. A demonstration of this proposition, however, would, as has already been said, take us only to the threshold of the question we have been struggling with. For it might well be the case that, whereas genuine love between humans consists of an immediate relation, the love of God consists of feeling only. Indeed, this is bound to be true if the faith which knows this God is itself nothing more than subjective feeling. What, in the light of the foregoing, are we to make of this possibility? Is that Bertrand Russell claim. The first thing to say is that if it is true, there can be no genuine love of God at all, since there can be no openness to the other, which even love between humans requires. The second thing is that pseudo love of God is the legitimate object of destructive criticism, and that from a perspective like Buber's, one cheerfully supports the criticism. That's fun. I like that. That's really fun. He's so this is he's making some bold assertions, and when he defined this type of an assertive faith as something we haven't seen in centuries, I think he's onto something here. And also, um, the entire dialectic between these camps is valuable. It's like, wow, we're really getting down to a new layer here, but he's providing that other side of the conversation on that layer. It's quite impressive. He says, okay, wait a minute. You can't say that someone loves God unless there actually is a God. You can say they have a feeling of love of God. Okay, so let's call that pseudo love of God. And then he says, from the perspective that believes that there is a God that you should have a genuine relationship with, all of your criticism is of pseudo love of God, and we cheerfully encourage you. He says, basically he says, I'm the sort of theist who's standing on the sidelines with pom poms going, go Bertrand Russell, go Bertrand Russell. All of you people that are attacking through criticism this whole idea of there even being a God, the only thing you can possibly attack is pseudo relationship with God and pseudo love of God. And so go, go, go. More power to you. Here's a megaphone. Here's a microphone. Here's a soapbox. Better heard. Okay, that's funny. And the third and most important thing to say is that genuine love of God, if there be such love, escapes the grasp of the subjectivist critic. Okay, so remember, he's defined an actual love relationship as an openness between two things, which can't possibly um, which get part of their definition of what they are in their relationship with each other. Okay. So he says, if there is a God, um, and you can have true love of him, if you are the sort of thing that in your fundamental nature is the sort of thing that should be relating to the divine, that's the sort of thing that the subjectivist critic can't possibly touch, because if it's legitimately that, there is no such thing as the singular individual feeling like he's having relationship with it's either a real relationship or it's not. And a real relationship requires that there be both entities. So so let's keep going and see where he goes with this. For genuine love of God, which is openness to the divine, can be known only in actual openness, and this is precisely what the critic cannot or will not have. Hence, he is left only with the images and feelings which are its byproduct. Okay, so he's actually making a different point there, which is that even the critic himself has to admit that he isn't attacking, he has no criticism of actual relationship with God. He only can criticize pseudo relationship with God, or feelings that are themselves an idol, but are not actually continued openness to relate to the other. Okay. Right? Do you see why? The reason why is that his criticism is founded in the idea that there is no other, and all that you have is just some projection of yourself. He says, well, good. Criticize that all day long. That'd be great. Let's get rid of all of that. So criticize that all day long, but notice that you haven't even said anything at all. He's saying you haven't said anything at all. If there is a God that you can relate to, you've given no reason for thinking that's not the case. You've just defined something else, which we'll call pseudo relationship with God, and you've said that's nothing but a projection. And some people say, yeah, but it's an important one, and you got to keep it. He says, no, you can't keep it if that's all you're saying about it, and you should criticize the hell out of it and go for it. But he's pointing out that it's just a statement of faith on your part to say that that's all there is. You haven't given us a reason to believe that's all there is. How then can he judge them as byproducts? How indeed can he safely distinguish between the pseudo faith and pseudo love, which are merely feelings projected onto a pseudo God, and the genuine faith and love, which constitute a relationship, a relation to God? It would seem, therefore, that the critic's reduction, even of pseudo faith, must always remain ambiguous and can never be final. This does not prevent him, however, from deciding that religious images and feelings are never born of real encounters. And he's underlining you had no reason to conclude that, but you decided it. That they are always mere imagination. Only in making this decision, he does not give a demonstration. Buber's response to the challenge of subjectivist reductionism has disclosed that it does not refute biblical faith, but rather that it opposes one faith to another. Biblical faith strikes or stakes all on man's primordial openness to the divine, an openness, to be sure, which is interrupted by eclipses of God. The reductionist faith stakes all on the thesis that man is primordially shut off from God, and that all supposed openness is mere self delusion. But in the perspective of Buber's modern reaffirmation of the biblical faith, reductionism itself appears as a self delusion. It mistakes withdrawal from God for the natural and inevitable human condition. This is pretty bold. It's quite remarkable. Um, I'm not sure I've read this argument before. It's pretty interesting. All right, wrapping it up. In such manner, does faith refute the refutation proposed by subjectivist reductionism? But this is not to say that faith can prove its own case against subjectivist reductionism. It cannot refute, but only reject it, and it can testify against it. For the argument cuts both ways. The reductionist cannot use observable data, religious images, and feelings to demonstrate the subjectivity of faith. But neither can the believer use these same data to demonstrate the objectivity of faith. For not only is it the case that the reductionist critic cannot or will not enter into the actual relation of openness to God, it is also the case that for the believer himself, the knowledge obtained is shot through with the gravest of risks. After all, does not disguised self love, being disguised, mistake itself for love of God? Are not God projections, being unconscious, mistaken for real gods by those who are prey to them? This is fantastic. Some part of this risk has always been understood by believers in the biblical tradition who realize that false prophets, no less than true, can be sincere. The full extent of the risk, however, has become obvious only to the modern believer. His ancestor rarely doubted that man was in principle open to the divine, hence, the risk of which he was aware extended for the most part only to deciding when and how such openness was truly manifest. The modern believer, by contrast, has glimpsed the possibility that all openness to the divine may be pseudo openness only, that man may be radically alone. He does not stand in immediate openness to the divine. he seeks, in Kierkegaard's expression, an immediacy after reflection. The psalmist, in Extremis, experienced an eclipse of God. The extremity of faith in the modern age is uncertainty as to whether what is experienced is an eclipse of God or the final exposure of an illusion. Hence, okay, so let's just pause before we read the last two paragraphs. Where he's gotten to is the place of saying, um, it was thought that faith is unthinkable now because we've got good arguments against it. What I've now done is I've analyzed what that argument really was. The argument was subjectivist reductionism. He says it wasn't about science disproving God. It wasn't about all the atrocities that happened in the 20th century that made us stop believing in God. He says really what happened was we came to realize philosophically that just because I have a feeling of a relationship with the divine doesn't mean that there's a divine there because I could be in a self delusion. Why? And if I'm going to use Occam's razor, which is sort of a scientism ethos, which he hinted at possibly, but in any case, if I'm going to use uh, certain principles of right thinking that are arguable, but they're debatable, but they're arguable. Then I would say, why would I postulate an infinite supernatural being just to explain a feeling? Maybe I'm just the sort of creature that has these kinds of feelings. He says, okay, so that's what it's come down to. And then he looked at all of the places where you can stand to make that criticism. And he said, hot, stop calling the kettle black. We're all in the same position. Notice he doesn't do that disingenuously to then say, so therefore I can prove God exists. He's not doing that at all. He's saying that's the nature of um of this the nature of this type of criticism that's so devastating or seemingly so devastating reduces to wherever you want to be when you want to interpret the feelings that people report when they're having religious experience or claiming to is a faith position. If you are the sort of thing that is built to have relationship with the divine, if what you are is half divine or you're made up as the logos communication between infinite being and non-being, if part of what you are is from your primordial origin partly divine, then you should be open to relationship with that side of the two things that make you up, the divine. And if that's the case, rather than it all just being, maybe accidental, that you're just a weird, insane creature that has these feelings, if that's the case, you're in the same exact position as everybody who thinks it's not the case. There's no argument that's been presented. There's no philosophical argument from Freud or Marx or subjectivist, how he's calling them subjectivist reductionists. None of them uh, can actually have even begun to provide an argument for why you shouldn't believe that that's the case. What they've done is they've denied a priori that that's the case, and then they're just hoping you'll agree with them. I mean, it's he's saying it's a faith position all around, and it puts this stark sort of naked, like, well, I say I'm the sort of thing that needs to relate to the divine, and I've had experiences which are like that. And he says, well, you don't know that that's true, right? So he's saying the people who are saying, well, for sure that's just a delusion, have no evidence for it and no reason for saying it's a delusion. And likewise, you have no argument you can make to them that it's not a delusion. We're all in the same place. But what he's done is he said there is no argument. There's no argument from the other side that to tell you that that's not the case. Okay. All right. Hence, if the modern believer works and waits for an end to this eclipse, he must carry in his working and waiting a uniquely modern burden. The psalmist in Extremis could rest in the irrefutability of faith. The modern believer in Extremis must endure the full impact of its being undemonstrable as well. He must suffer the knowledge that to the world around him, the absent God is a non existent God, and that he himself can do no more than testify to the contrary. Under these circumstances, it is natural that there should be those who wish to be told whether the present crisis of religious faith will lead to a renewal. But anyone who asks for a prediction does not understand what has been said. Pronouncements upon the future that is at stake here could not take the form of scientific or historical prediction, but only of indulgence in prophecy. And a rabbinic sage wisely observed that when biblical times came to an end, prophecy was taken away from prophets and given over to fools and children. All right, that's a nice little way of ending it. But there's one question which remains, which is he had the seeds of this sort of an idea when he was making his analogy to the problem of other minds. And it's possible that you can okay, so what is he doing? He's examining what it means to be an I and to understand that you are a you. And he says that completely requires the thou. You can't even develop the notion of yourself as a thing, except that you develop it in relationship to other entities. You even become aware of them before you're aware of yourself. Descartes and Socrates, both, as two examples from a long time ago, were making exactly that argument when they were arguing for our relationship to the divine and for our understanding of the divine. Was that you are the sort of thing that if you examine yourself to see what sort of a nature you have, you're the sort of thing that must be in relationship with this thing. Now, maybe you don't know it, maybe you deny it, but when you examine, you can come to the conclusion that there must be an infinite that's at least a part of the explanation. He keeps using the phrase your primordial origin. I don't even think he says origin, but your primordial nature, like at the base of what you are, is the sort of thing that can't be unless it's in relationship with the divine. So it's possible that we could get to that, I think, although he seems to be denying that at the end. He's saying, well, when God shows up, you'll know he's real. But if God's in an eclipse right now, then if you want to have faith, you can, because there's no argument that he doesn't exist. And you can offer that you feel like you're in relationship to him, but no one has to accept that because he's not showing up. He showed up for you, but we can just say you're under a delusion, or that's the sort of projection that a creature like you would make, or it's just reducible to feelings or subconscious sexual repression or class warfare or whatever the heck your theory is. You've got no argument for why we should have to accept that it's actually a God you're relating to. And if you're in a moment of doubt, you're going to have to deal with this subjectivist reductionism, which says, no, there never has been any such thing. Um, which I want to make one more comment about these arguments I've brought up about Descartes and Socrates, who both are making this argument. Well, we can know the fact of God's existence. I don't think that's what they were doing. I don't think they were saying, oh, you can know the fact that God exists through examining what you are. I think what they were doing was advocating for direct relationship. There's a weird paragraph in Descartes' third meditation where he ends the meditation with, before we go on thinking about anything else, let's just sit here and meditate on the glory of this divine that we've discovered we're in relationship with. And it doesn't make sense for a philosophical argument unless he's actually doing a meditation. His actual purpose is to bring you on a mystical journey through organizing your thoughts well enough to get rid of the wrong ones so that you can have an actual religious experience. Excuse me, have an actual religious experience by walking along the arguments with him. I think that's the case. We can talk more about that, but we will in year two. But in any case, Socrates was clearly doing that as well. We've said it before. He says, on the day of his death, he says, look, we've been doing arguments and we've been trying to figure out the truth and we've been dialecticing back and forth. But really, we've been trying to relate to the source of all truth, beauty, justice, goodness, and love. And that's what we've really been around, is orienting ourselves towards a relationship with this thing where we might know it well enough to see its qualities and other things rightly, rather than calling ugly things beautiful and beautiful ugly. We know beauty qua beauty. And so now we can see other things' participation with that and then rightly judge them. And the same with truth and justice and all of that. But he had understood it as relational. So these are not they're I think they're by definition and the authors of them are aware of the fact that they're not making like a QED deductive argument where they're saying, oh, A and then B, therefore C. They're doing that also as much as they can, and Descartes is kind of trying to do that. But that isn't even the point for Descartes. There's this, hey, now that we've gotten there, holy cow, let's just meditate on the beauty of this thing, because we got rid of all the things that would stop us from seeing it through 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 the meditation. Again, that's just I'm just saying what he's claiming. I'm not saying he did it or succeeded or anything. I'm saying that's what he's claiming he's doing. And that's what he's aimed at. And so they're seeing it as relational, and um, that the highest aim for us, Socrates, I gave up on mathematics, I gave up on way lesser sciences. It's ethics, it's how we should live and what kind of creature we should be. The highest aim was being in relationship with this divine for these thinkers, and they had it conceptualized in as relationship. And uh, so so we'll have to revisit this, but I'm going to pause or shut up now for a bit and ask you to give us your reflections on this argument, because this is definitely something I've never read before, and it was pretty impressive. So I know that video doesn't work so well. I'll turn my camera off if you'd like to say anything, and then we'll go to the after show and we'll talk more about it.
It kind of reminds me of, I don't know if it was William James was the first that we came across in here to where he's saying whether so not William James but Fackenheim is okay whether you believe or whether you don't believe in God. He's saying he sees both sides, but you're at the same point. It reminds me, I think it was William James. I'm trying to remember what it was. For the first time, it wasn't. It's either this or that. He saw both sides of it.
That's right. That's right. In the determinism versus free
Yes.
will, I think that was
Yes.
the most outstanding essay
Yes.
from that section, was the William Jamesian one.
Determinism
And
versus
he's doing, you're totally right. I'm glad you drew that connection. He's totally coming along and saying, okay, you guys have this knockdown argument for determinism. You guys think you have this knockdown argument for free will.
right.
I'm going to tell you, you all have no knockdown argument for anything. And we're
They're
left in
both
this
faith
space.
positions.
Yeah. And he's being a pragmatist. He's saying, well, okay, there isn't actually evidence for agreeing with either of these propositions. What there is the consequences of deciding to believe one way or another, and you can't tell me I don't get to make that choice. I'm going to choose based on looking at the philosophical consequences, and but ultimately it's not like he says, well, I look at the consequences, I say, oh, this reduces to absurdism, so therefore I'll go the other way. He says, no, there's always a response. This is an endless conversation. The response from either side of the thesis and antithesis can go back and forth forever, but you have to live. So decide what you're going to think and live, and see, and we'll just run the experiment. See how well life works out for you if you decide to think one way or another. And, he's not even drawing foregone conclusions on any of that. He's just saying the best you can do is be honest with yourself about why, and honest with others about why you've decided to live in that sort of way. And there is something like that in this essay, especially because of the eclipse of God. I mean, he almost is saying, well, when the eclipse is over, then you'll know that there's a God, right? But we're in an eclipse. And so, as long as the eclipse is happening, we're in exactly that same William Jamesian place where it says, where he's, look, my job, says Fackenheim in this essay, is to let you know that there is no argument or no evidence to make you conclude one or the other. There's absolutely, it seems like there is, because everybody's in this fad of going this one way, But let's look at the power of their argument. It's reduced to their faith position that there is no such thing, and the other side is reduced to the faith position that there is. And it just gets reduced to that. There is no thing you've discovered in your telescope or your microscope that would make you say it has to be interpreted this way or that way. And so yeah, that's a really good connection. He's so I think he was maybe a little unfair to the pragmatists because I think that they're not saying it's useful even though it's not true. I think what the pragmatists are saying is what is useful, in other words, what ideas you operate with that get you from point A to point B that work for life are by definition the ideas that are most in accordance with the environment surrounding you and the world you live in. Right? Like that's just what it means to be true for the pragmatist, is that the idea that works is the one that maps the world the best,
Right.
right? So they're not saying, well, it works, even though it's not true. They're saying, no, it works. That's my evidence that it's true. Right? So maybe he was a little unfair in his paragraph on the pragmatists, but obviously the thing he was criticizing there, which he was calling pragmatism, should be criticized for exactly. He says if somebody were to say, well, it's not true, but let's keep the illusion going, from a philosophical perspective, you could say, okay, well, that's pretty weak sauce. I think that maybe he doesn't understand how much work the pragmatists were doing for because you're right, it's exactly the same way that William James was thinking in that essay. That's a really good thing to highlight. It's exactly the way William James was thinking. And man, that was a good essay. We should read that again at some point.
It was. I agree. I think it was useful.
Once again, an awesome connection between William James and something else made by yourself. All right, on that awesome note, we're going to go into the after conversation where we'll probably talk more about Mr. James. So we'll end stream.